Welcome back to the WeatherNation podcast. I'm Dakota Smith alongside Patrick Crawford. Patrick, episode 3. It's your first time on the show.
Is this so? When we look at trilogies, is it the third episode that is usually the best one?
Well, it depends what you ask. It depends what trilogy we're talking about.
We might have to make sure that's the case, at least with
the Star Wars, Lord of the Rings.
There's a lot to compare to.
Star Wars, yes.
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings, maybe yes, also.
Okay.
So that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, that is right. That's a different podcast.
Yeah, it's a different podcast.
Absolutely.
But Patrick, first time on the show.
It is.
Tell us about yourself. So that we can get to know you a little
Absolutely,
bit
Dakota. I appreciate you having me on. I am a meteorologist here at WeatherNation. I've been at WeatherNation for just over a year. Prior to WeatherNation, I was doing weather in Green Bay, Wisconsin. As far as my career, I've gone many different places through my lifetime in the TV news business. Graduated college in 2004 from Northern Illinois University. Been in the TV business since then. I've worked anywhere from New Orleans, Louisiana, Fayetteville, Arkansas, Rockford, Illinois. Even had a stop in Yuma, Arizona. Not really a big weather mecca of the United States, but still it was a good experience. But yeah, so that's a little bit about me.
Great. Well, thanks for coming on and really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And hopefully you'll be a returning visitor as we have a sort of...
Well, you know, I hope I'm allowed to return because it might mean some awkward conversations with us because we work together.
Yeah. No, you'll definitely be back on as long as you want to come back on.
Good.
Okay, so just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the top weather stories. If you're listening right now on Apple Podcast, please rate and review the show. It helps us get some traction. It honestly tells us what you think about the show, if we can improve it, what you like, what you don't like.
Absolutely.
So please rate and review and comment wherever you're listening right now. So yeah, let's dive right into it. This week, top weather stories. Patrick, pretty obvious story. Over the weekend, we had snow and ice across the southern United States. Snow started in Texas. Some ice came into Arkansas and Alabama, and then a widespread of foot fell in Virginia, North Carolina, even South Carolina got a little bit on the action there. The largest snow report I saw was a whopping 34 inches at Mount Mitchell State Park in western North Carolina. Patrick, you've been following this forecast all week and you've been covering it on air. What stands out to you about this system?
Well, you know, the thing that stood out to me is that with this particular system, I thought the long-range forecast models were doing a good job of kind of showing us that something was going to be developing in the eastern Pacific and it was going to sweep across the country. And of course, with these long-range forecast models, you kind of take it with a grain of salt. You just say, okay, we're going to keep an eye on that. But then each model run that came out, we kept seeing it. Yeah, it looks more likely that all this energy that we're seeing in the eastern Pacific, western California, it's going to swing across the country, and that's exactly what happened. So that's what stood out to me, is just the amount of time in advance that we've been really kind of worried about maybe this might be something bad. I remember I texted my brother when I was looking at one of the model runs. He lives in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, with his family, and I texted him. I said, hey, next week, you know, this was about a week out. I said, there might be something. It might close some schools, maybe work. You might not have to work. And he's like, I'll believe it when I see it or whatever. And you know, it kind of came true. He didn't have to go to work. All his kids, school was canceled and everything. And I think in Winston-Salem they were looking at close to 15 inches is what they got there.
Yeah, were you jealous? Are you a snow guy?
I am not a snow guy.
Yeah.
I went to college in a snowy area, northern Illinois. It's in DeKalb, Illinois, so we got a lot of snow. I remember walking to class in the snow. I do prefer warmer weather. That is definitely, ideal for me. But, the job takes you to places where maybe it's not your choice of weather, and you kind of just go for the job.
Well, it's a good start for the season this year then, because we really haven't had much snow here in Denver.
Absolutely.
So on to another story here. The Pacific Northwest is slated to see sort of a parade of storms over the next week, next 2 weeks. There's going to be a ton of snow in the Olympics, the Cascades, and then Seattle and surrounding areas are also just going to get a ton of rain. We actually talked to Gwynn Howitt, the Vice President of Operations at Mount Baker Ski Resort, who are expecting several feet of snow.
This series of storms coming in this week is allowing us to be able to say that we are going to open on Wednesday. We're going to start with our upper base area and 3 chairlifts, and then we're looking at 4 to 5 feet of snow in the next 4 or 5 days.
It'll be an exciting opening week for them at Mount Baker Ski Resort. Patrick, what do you think we should be watching with this system? Because this system is going to come into the Pacific Northwest and sort of come through the central U.S. bring rain and snow throughout there. But then there's going to be system after system. What do you think we should be watching with these storms?
Well, obviously the snow, it's going to be, a big part of this system. The winds are going to be a big part of this particular system, especially across the high plains. And when you factor in snow and winds, then of course blizzard-like conditions, maybe even some blizzard watches or blizzard warnings. So I think that's going to be an issue. And then also, it's just the amount of rainfall that's going to be in the forecast into western Washington, maybe northwest Oregon, but it looks like western Washington, we could be in excess of 6, 7, maybe 8 inches just of rain alone in those areas. So rising streams, rivers, creeks, that sort of thing, and then of course the flash flooding aspect. But like you said, there's going to be another system moving in right after this one, and it's going to bring more of the same, the wind, the mountain snow. So that's what we're watching, is just how intense are these other systems going to be after this one. And like you mentioned, this one's going to be very interesting because it started out as energy in the Gulf of Alaska, it's moving into the northwest, then it's going to sweep across the Rockies and down into the southern plains, and it looks like it's going to start to become more of a strong upper level low right there along the coast of the United States, the Gulf Coast. So Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, it looks like it could be a very active, stormy forecast. It's a little different with the track of this system. It doesn't have a lot of cold air that's going to really interact with as it starts to move into the southeastern U.S. So luckily, we're not looking at a repeat performance of that very heavy snow that we had with this last system, but there could be some heavy rain across the Mississippi Valley into the southeast and then along the coast. Always got to worry about when you get those lows, those spin-ups over the Gulf waters that could come on shore as a tornado. So I think the tornadic threat might be something to watch as well.
Sort of what we saw last week. I know Florida had two confirmed, I think it was EF0 tornadoes on Sunday from this storm. But that's a good point about the cold air not being there as much as last week. But it does look like some of the parts that got a lot of snow in like the Carolinas and the southeast could see a lot of rain, so the flood threat, I think, could ramp up.
Yeah, because, that snow, it's going to melt, so therefore you're saturating the ground just with the snow melt itself. The rivers, the streams, the creeks, they're going to rise as well with that. So you factor in another couple inches of rain, then yeah, that flooding risk is definitely going to be a concern.
Yeah, so we'll be monitoring that on our site, on our programming, so check that out, weathernationtv.com. Up next, Patrick, I'm going to quiz you on some trivia.
I was told there would be no quizzing.
You were told the exact opposite.
I know. I thought I was done with school. That's all I got to say.
But first, let's hear from John Van Pelt for his safety tip of the week.
Sounds good.
Hello there, John Van Pelt with this week's tip of the week, and this time we're talking about ways to stay alive or better in the wintertime. Winter survival tips.
We have to worry about power outages. Some of those can be extended power outages, and if you have electric heat, one of the things you need to have ready is an alternate source of heat if you can, whether that be a space heater like a kerosene or propane heater. You want to make sure you use it safely, and one of the tips we talked about in getting our homes ready is make sure those heaters stay away from draperies and bed clothing that could catch on fire. Also, you need to be sure to have a carbon monoxide detector in your house on every floor if you use fossil fuels. And if you're going to run a generator, keep it outside, at least 20 feet away from vents and windows and doors to make sure the carbon monoxide stays outside your house. You want to make sure you've got at least a gallon of water per day per person in your house. Plenty of food you can prepare without electricity if you don't have power or a generator. That means food bars, easy to prepare canned foods, things like that. And plus, of course, batteries, flashlights, LED lanterns. Don't use candles in an emergency. A lot of people end up having home fires because of candles. Also, if you're in an area where your pipes don't normally freeze, but you get an extended period of cold weather that might freeze those pipes, if you can insulate them beforehand, that's great. But if not, leave your counter doors open under the sinks and let those pipes drip so they won't freeze and burst.
And of course, we've got lots more winter survival tips and even pictures, some of them moving, on the video version of the tip of the week you'll see on WeatherNation TV all week, and of course on the video podcast too. So join us there, won't you?
Thanks so much, John, giving us that safety tip every week.
John's a great guy. With this last storm system that moved through, we were actually talking about this before we came on for the podcast. He was just a trooper. He was live shot after live shot, just giving us all this information. He was in North Carolina. He was kind of hovering around Raleigh and Durham and just giving us all this important information. Of course, North Carolina was one of the worst as far as the amount of snow they got. So he just did a great job. He's just a great person to have on the team.
Yeah, he's a hard worker.
Big shout out to JVP.
We're actually going to have him on in our guest segment this week after trivia. So
okay.
We'll do a little more deep dive with him about some of the coverage this week and even some of the coverage he did during the tropics, because that was he was there for Michael and Florence. So
yeah, tune into that because John Van Pelt, he's just a fountain of information. He's just got so many tidbits, anecdotes, everything. It's just a lot of fun talking to him. Even when we're on air in the studio, just talking to him, he's a great guy to talk to.
yeah, should be a fun interview.
Yeah.
First, Patrick.
Okay.
I have some questions for you.
Let's do it. Let's quiz it up.
There's no prize, but there is shame if
Well,
you...
I was going to say there's probably bragging rights if I can get a
Sure,
get a couple of these right.
There's bragging rights and then there's shame.
Okay.
So,
All right.
let's see how I do here.
Okay.
Okay. So over the weekend, as you know, Richmond, Virginia received 11.5 inches of the fluffy stuff,
Okay.
their second largest December snowstorm in history.
Okay.
This also marks the earliest snowstorm of 10 inches or more in the city of Richmond. What was the previous record? So when was the previous earliest 10-plus inch storm in Richmond? So it happened...
So you want a date? You're looking for a date?
Looking for a date. It's multiple
Okay.
choice.
Okay.
All right. So I guess December 10th is the new record.
Okay.
Was the previous record December 12th, December 16th, a 2-day storm from December 19th to the 20th, or D, a 2-day storm from December 22nd to the 23rd?
I'm leaning towards C and D only because you had the 2-day storm there, and usually a 2-day storm, it can definitely leave a lot of snow on the ground. My last name is Crawford. That begins with the letter C. I'm going C.
C. All right. 2-day storm from December 19th to 20th. That is wrong.
Ah!
As you were close though.
Oh,
it
so
was
it's
D.
Okay.
It was D.
Okay.
Yeah. So
If only my last name was like,
Golfers.
Davidson or something. I would have got it right.
So the answer D, from December
Okay.
22nd to December 23rd in 1908, Richmond saw a whopping 17.2 inches of snow. This storm actually ranks as the 4th largest snowstorm in Richmond history and the largest in December history for Richmond.
Okay.
So that was quite a big storm.
That absolutely was, yeah.
Yeah. All right.
And
Next,
what was the year that happened?
1908.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a long
So
time ago.
close to the beginning of when their records
Yeah.
began in Richmond.
Wow.
All right. Question 2.
Okay.
Seattle is poised to get soaked over the next 10 days with inches and inches of rain in the forecast. The persistent showers are sure to make for a wet December, but do you know the most precipitation ever recorded in Seattle during the month of December and which year it happened?
So I'm getting multiple choice on
You're
this
getting
one,
multiple
right?
choice
Okay.
again.
Wow,
Yeah.
because this is a two-parter.
This is a two-parter, yeah.
Okay.
So we're going to get 3 questions.
All
All right. A, 16.6 inches in 2006. B, 15.3 in 1933. C, 13.1 in 1953. Or D, 11.2 in 2015. Do you need repeats there?
I'll need a repeat because I'm
Okay.
trying to get the
Yep.
years as well here.
All right, so A, around 16 and a half in 2006.
Okay.
B, 15.3 in 1933. C, 13.1 in 1953. Or D, 11.2 in 2015.
So I'm going to go with either B or C just based on the year because I'm just going to go with an older number.
Okay.
You know what? Last name begins with
sticking
C.
with the last
I'm
name?
going C.
Okay, you really gotta stick. you nail it to the 2, and then you pick the
I picked the wrong
Crawford.
one.
So next time you're
Go
on
the
trivia,
opposite.
go the opposite
Okay.
of C.
Opposite
Yeah.
of C. Okay.
So the answer that's pretty good. I'll give you credit for that.
Okay.
You know,
All right.
you if this were
That's how I take tests as well in real life. I narrow it down,
narrow
and
it
then
down.
I typically go with C for Crawford.
if this were Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and you
Yeah.
got the 50-50,
Yeah.
like you would have gotten it.
There we
So,
go. Okay.
all right, so the answer B, 15.3 inches in 1933. December of 1933, rain created a deluge across Washington, shutting down railways and prompting many water rescues. Snow actually came later in the month, adding to this precipitation record. December of 1933 was actually the wettest month in Seattle history until November of 2006 beat it out. So just 12 years ago, they had a new wettest month of the year. So that record stood for quite a long time,
Yeah.
almost 80 years. Fun fact about this record that I like doing a little bit of research
I like
here.
fun facts. Keep them coming.
This month was also wet in another way.
Okay.
December 5th, 1933, marked the introduction of the 21st Amendment and the repeal of the 18th U.S. Amendment. Do you know what that is? Any idea? Sorry, I'm adding another
Well,
question.
well, since you said wet, then I'm going to have to go with prohibition.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Nailed it.
There we
the
go.
repeal of prohibition. This meant cases and cases of alcohol were being carted into the city during this month as
Yeah.
they were getting flooded and all this rain and snow.
Well, I mean, that's how you survive, right? The rain and the snow.
That's how
At
you
least
stay warm. Yeah.
Back in the 30s, that's how
Back
they
in the
did
30s,
it.
little whiskey, stay warm. Yeah. But Patrick, good job overall. You
I'm
you
very
got that
proud.
bonus. You got the
And
prohibition
the bonus counts as more too, so it kind of cancels it out.
I think technically it does.
So I think I did a great job.
So
I
yeah.
like it.
So yeah, Patrick, great job.
All right.
Stick with us. Up next, we have John Van Pelt coming to chat about some of his coverage this year. Stay with us.
You're listening to the WeatherNation podcast. To tune into more WeatherNation coverage, you can watch live programming on Amazon Fire, Roku, and any of your favorite streaming services.
And welcome back to the WeatherNation podcast. I'm Dakota Smith, and I am going to bring in our very own John Van Pelt, field correspondent, covering all the storms, big and small. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dakota. It's good to be here. I'm excited about the podcast.
Yeah, so you were this weekend covering some of the snow you all got in North Carolina. I couldn't believe some of the totals I saw. How much did you actually end up seeing where you were?
In Raleigh, we got about 7 inches. Then I went a little bit west to Durham, where there was almost 10. And then in Hillsboro, I was between 10 and 11 inches there. It was amazing to see that much snowfall this early in December. For us here, that's like a January or February storm if we get that much at one time in a single system.
Yeah, and what sort of impacts did you see? I imagine travel was tricky. There were some power outages. What else did you all see down there?
Yeah, the travel on 85 was the biggest problem I saw, although the state did a heck of a job prepping the roads. They put out 1.1 million gallons of brine in the state, which is just an amazing amount. They started actually working on it Thursday, worked through Thursday, Friday, and then Saturday midday to get that brine down from west to east. So the traffic accidents were not nearly the number I thought I would have seen. I saw a couple of people get sideways and a couple of people stuck, but personally I didn't see any major crashes in all the miles I drove. Power outages were a big deal. At one time about 250,000 North Carolinians were without power, but the crews, they had brought in like 1,500 crews from out of state, so they were getting up the power pretty quick. And by yesterday, when the governor did a press conference, that was on Monday, when the governor did a press conference on Monday morning at 11 o'clock, there were 150,000 still in the dark, and a few hours later they had that down to 70,000. So they've done an amazing work getting that power back up.
Wow. And where does this rank for you in terms of snowstorms in North Carolina? When's the last time you had something this big?
We had a storm where we had nearly 6 inches here in Raleigh last year, but to see the multiple feet almost in the mountains and to see that amount of snowfall all the way up here to the Triangle and east down to the Sandhills was pretty amazing. I do not remember, I've been here almost my whole life, I don't remember a storm this big this early in December ever.
Yeah. Yeah, I know a few cities, like Richmond had I think it was the biggest storm that early in the year. So
yeah, some places in North Carolina got well over their yearly snowfall in just that one day.
Yeah, wow. And so this snowstorm has been sort of just the sprinkle or cherry on top of sort of a wild year for that area. You guys had Florence just, my gosh, what was that? Early September, something like that. And you were covering that for us as well. I don't know where to even begin, John, but what was it like covering that storm? What was it like going through a storm of that that had such an impact on North Carolina?
You know, the governor, when he was talking about the winter storm yesterday, I know people in North Carolina are getting tired of these disasters, but we got to work together and do what we can to get through them. Florence, and Martin came too from Denver. So Martin and I were in Morehead City for Florence when it was bearing down on the Carolinas as a Category 4. If it had made landfall as a Category 4, it would have been the intensity it was at that point, it would have been the strongest storm ever to hit North Carolina. Hazel back in '54 was a Category 4 hurricane, but obviously in 1954 there was not nearly the development on the coast or even, of course, in the whole state that there was. So I live in Raleigh. I was worried. My mom and my sister live here. I was worried about them because I was going to be on the coast somewhere, knowing that it might come through Raleigh as a Category 2 or stronger. We had Hurricane Fran that was barely a hurricane. It was probably actually a strong tropical storm when it got to Raleigh. And there were trees down across every road in town, and people were without power for 8 days after that storm. So to see Florence coming in as a potential Category 4, that was pretty scary. Not just, you get a little nervous when you're on the coast for one of those. And we would have gotten out of the way. Martin and I would have been safe no matter what happened. But when we were in Morehead City, we were thinking about 18, 19 feet of surge possible. So when we were checking into the hotel, we were going to, how high is this place? But that was intense. And where we were, the way the coast is there, we think about coast going north-south. But this is an east to west coast down there in Morehead City, Atlantic Beach, Emerald Isle, all those places. So the way the storm was coming in, we had wind for probably 30 hours. We lost power at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and landfall in Wilmington was, early in the morning the next day on Friday. So we were getting hammered in Morehead City for hours, just a day and a half.
And then it wasn't even the landfall that seemed to have the biggest impact. It was sort of after the storm, there was just rain for days, and the rivers kept rising. There's a little bit of a lag there from when the rivers start to flood after the rain. And I know you were down there for some of that. I mean, what did you see, and what sort of was the biggest takeaway from the flooding event after landfall?
Yeah, as a young disc jockey, my first job was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. So I was obviously concerned for them. I had Hurricane David back in '79, was my first hurricane, and you know what it can do to a tourist town, just the actual landfall. But that storm did stall and moved inland, and I was out for 3 weeks because it dropped so much rain inland, North and South Carolina, that it took more than a week for the rivers to get all the way back down to the coast. And in Georgetown, South Carolina, they were worried about where they have 5 rivers come together in Georgetown. They were worried about historic flooding down there. So they prepared for that, and they sandbagged the downtown area. Luckily, the water slowed down and spread out. But in places like Socastee, which is outside of Myrtle Beach, and Conway, South Carolina, and Long, South Carolina, and Little River, those people went underwater. And there were 2,000 houses in Horry County, which is where Myrtle Beach is, 2,000 houses underwater that most of them had never flooded before, and some of them had 1-story deep water in them.
And then after Florence, Michael became the big story and the big event. What did you see during your coverage for that? I actually not 100% sure how much you were you there for the landfall of Michael?
I was actually here because we knew Michael was probably going to come through the Carolinas and up into Virginia, so I stayed here for landfall. I had some trees down, some power outages here in Raleigh for that, and actually people died from flooding and tornadoes in Virginia from Michael. But then I went down, and Martin and I were down there in Florida on the Panhandle, where it was the first Category 4 storm to ever make landfall on the Florida Panhandle. And we saw, Brandon Clement shot a lot of the early video from the helicopter and the drone that we saw of Mexico Beach and the destruction there. But when we got down there one-on-one and you stand there, I've seen a lot of destruction from hurricanes, but I'd never seen anything like that before, to see what it did to the Panhandle, the Panama City Beach, all the towns between there and Mexico Beach, and then to see the Air Force Base wasted like it was, and millions of pine trees down. I've never seen trees down like that, and mile after mile we rode down the highway, 198 I think, and the trees would be laid down toward the highway for miles, and then you could see the direction of the wind changing. When you got a few miles farther, the trees were all laid away from the highway. Devastation like I've never seen before. And
now still a lot of places are really just beginning to rebuild, particularly down in the Florida Panhandle. What do you think it says about these communities that sort of are rebounding now, and folks that are staying there and beginning that process?
For some of those people, it's going to be really hard depending on what kind of insurance they had, because many of the houses in Mexico Beach, for example, it's a little tiny town that tourists do go to, but it's a year-round community also, and some of those houses were built probably in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and not built to any particular standard at all. After Andrew in 92, there were the Miami-Dade codes came to be, which made sure that all the new structures were built to Miami-Dade codes would be much less likely to be destroyed by a major hurricane. But in Mexico Beach, of course, they had none of those standards. The Panhandle does have new standards, and I can't remember what year those came to be, but they're still not nearly as strong as the standards in Miami-Dade. So a lot of those people, if they didn't have the right kind of insurance, it's going to be impossible for them to rebuild, because they built their houses for tens of thousands of dollars, and now it's going to be in the hundreds of thousands or even low millions to rebuild some of those houses. We saw the house that Russell and LeBron had, the house that stood on Mexico Beach with only one bathroom window cracked. So the people that have the money are going to rebuild to those standards. And I feel like, which they built better than Miami-Dade standards. That's why that house stood through that hurricane. And a lot of the people that have the money are going to rebuild to bigger standards than that, because he told me it only cost Russell, one of the owners of that house, said it only cost 15-20% more than code would have cost to build their house, and it stood. They lost their stairway, which they expected to. It was built that way, and they had a cracked window. So the people that have the money that can rebuild to keep a house there, and that'll save a lot of insurance money in the future too, because when you have a devastating storm like Florence and Michael that hit such widespread areas, a lot of smaller insurance companies are just going to go out of business.
And so shifting sort of subjects a little bit, I was here and I was working with you a little bit when we were covering the hurricanes, and I have a question. Do you sleep? Because it doesn't seem like you sleep when we're doing the. I leave at like, I don't know. I was leaving at noon, and then would get back at 2 a.m. and you would still be with us. So like, what is that like? What's your schedule like when you're covering a big storm like Michael or Florence?
For hurricanes like that, we try to get as much rest beforehand as possible, and get plenty of liquids and food in us while we can, because then it ends up being, food bars and candy bars and chips and bottles of water for a few days. I think for Florence, Martin and I probably went 30 hours or so without any sleep at least. And anybody who knows Martin, he can go a week without a sleep and one corn dog, and he's in good shape. He drove from Denver to Morehead City without stopping. So there have been hurricanes before where I didn't sleep for 72 hours, but this one I think Florence, we got some sleep. We went about 30 hours straight and then got 4 or 5 hours of sleep and got back at it. The biggest problem down there, and I'm not complaining because it was nothing like the people who lived there and lost property, but we lost power at 3 o'clock. So we were without power and hot water for about 5 days. But we had plenty of flashlights and food we could eat without power, so that was not that big a deal.
Yeah, that's incredible.
AC, the lack of AC is the big problem.
Yeah, geez. So the tropics wasn't the only big topic this year. One event that you covered that sticks out to me was the flooding in Ellicott City, Maryland. Partly because I'm familiar with the area, but also just because the imagery that came out of that was just so shocking. And it's the second time in I don't know how many years, like in the span of like 5 years or something. That's 2 years. Yeah. So
yeah.
Tell me about covering that and having to cover it again. A very similar event.
Yeah, the first time was, if I remember right, it was July 4th weekend, 2016. They had basically a 1,000-year flood. And for people who don't know what that means, it doesn't mean it happens once every 1,000 years. It means every year there's a 1,000th of a chance, 1 in 1,000 chance of you having a kind of flood like that in a specific area. So they had their 1,000-year flood July 4th weekend, if I remember right, 2016, which took 7-8 feet of water down the main street, the historic main street, destroyed a lot of businesses and homes. Some of the cases, people were out of their homes down there for 5 months. And then they got back in their house, and after they got back in their place, less than a year and a half later, they get another flood. What struck me about both of them, The first one, we lost 2 people, which was awful. But when you see the amount of water, the speed and the volume of that water, to think only 2 people were lost when so many people were in their cars on that main street is amazing. This time we lost 1 person, and it's because he went in to try to rescue a lady who was trapped with her cat, and unfortunately he got swept away, but she was okay. So only 1 person was lost in this last flood. But this time after this happened, a lot of people had just gotten back on their feet. Businesses had rebuilt, stores that had been there for years, restocked, put everything back new in there, and lost it all again. So the heart-wrenching thing about that was that some of these people are never going to be able to rebuild their businesses. They'll never go back downtown because 2,000-year storms in 2 years, they just said, we're done.
Yeah. Is there any other event that sticks out with you this year that you covered that that made an impact on you?
You know, we had some snow in D.C., and I got to go to D.C. for the Cherry Blossom Festival, and we were worried, and this wasn't a huge event, but we were worried that it was going to ruin the festival because the early snow might take all the blooms off the trees, and it is beautiful. I've never been before and seen all those cherry trees around the tidal basin there. So that was something that I went to cover, wondering, you know, is it going to ruin this big tourism thing? Having been through Myrtle Beach for Hurricane David, I was kind of brought up as a broadcaster in a tourist market. And I know what devastation it can have, not just for the people whose homes get destroyed and whose businesses get destroyed, but the physical loss of income for large areas. In D.C., obviously, that's a big weekend for them. So anytime there's big events like that, I like to cover them to talk about the economic impact and to make sure people know that everything's going to get rebuilt and people can go back to this time Panama City Beach and Panama Beach and Mexico Beach when they get it all built back. And the whole East Coast was threatened by these storms, and the Gulf Coast. Anywhere a hurricane makes landfall is going to be a tourist area at some point or another. So the economic impacts concern me, and that's what I want to let people know. And inland, too, like the Gatlinburg fires. I like to let people know that places that have been devastated are going to build back, and the people are strong in America. They help each other, and we'll get business back up and start having fun again as soon as possible.
Well, that's a great message to end on. John, thanks so much for all the amazing coverage that you did this year and what I assume in the future that you'll be covering. And thanks for joining us today on the show.
Yeah, man, great to be here.
Thanks, John. And thank you all for listening. That's going to do it for this week's episode of the WeatherNation podcast. Subscribe wherever you're listening, whether it's YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We would love to have you next week and for future episodes. If you liked any of the video or audio clips that we played, you can find the full versions on our TV programming and on our website, weathernationtv.com. And finally, if you're just listening to this podcast, we actually have a video version, which is right there on our YouTube page. Just search WeatherNation on YouTube, and you'll see our smiling faces and some great visuals to go along with the podcast. So thanks so much, and we'll see you next week.